Hello and welcome to Talking Tolkien. This is the 8th episode in the series, which covers Frodo's journey in The Lord of the Rings, told using the detailed game world of Lord of the Rings Online, and here we'll be following Frodo and the Fellowship as they navigate their way through the mines of Moria. The company are now trapped in the entrance hall at the western gate of Moria, with the passage back out blocked by boulders falling around the door of Durin after the attack by the Watcher in the water in the last episode. Led by Gandalf, the Fellowship reluctantly but determinedly begin their journey through the ancient Dwarven kingdom. As the wizard passed on ahead up the great steps, he held his staff aloft, and from its tip there came a faint radiance. The wide stairway was sound and undamaged. 200 steps they counted, broad and shallow, and at the top they found an arched passage with a level floor leading on into the dark. "Let us sit and rest and have something to eat here on the landing, since we can't find a dining room," said Frodo. He had begun to shake off the terror of the clutching arm, and suddenly he felt extremely hungry. The proposal was welcomed by all, and they sat down on the upper steps, dim figures in the gloom. After only a brief rest, they started on their way again. All were eager to get the journey over as quickly as possible, and were willing, tired as they were, to go on marching still for several hours. The passage twisted round a few turns and then began to descend. It went steadily down for a long while before it came level once again. The air grew hot and stifling, but it was not foul, and at times they felt currents of cooler air upon their faces, issuing from half-guessed openings in the walls. There were many of these. In the pale ray of the wizard's staff, Frodo caught glimpses of stairs and arches, and of other passages and tunnels, sloping up or running steeply down, or opening blankly dark on either side. It was bewildering beyond hope of remembering. There were not only many roads to choose from, there were also in many places holes and pitfalls, and dark wells beside the path in which their passing feet echoed. There were fissures and chasms in the walls and floors. Every now and then a crack would open right up before their feet. The widest was more than 7 feet across, and it was long before Pippin could summon enough courage to leap over the dreadful gap. The noise of churning water came up from far below, as if some great mill wheel was turning in the depths. It was after nightfall when they had entered the mines. They had been going for several hours with only brief halts when Gandalf came to his first serious check. Before him stood a wide, dark arch opening into 3 passages. All led in the same general direction, eastwards, but the left-hand passage plunged down, while the right-hand climbed up, and the middle way seemed to run on, smooth and level, but very narrow. "I have no memory of this place at all," said Gandalf, staring uncertainly under the arch. He held up his staff in the hope of finding some marks or inscription that might help his choice, but nothing of the kind was to be seen. "I'm too weary to decide," he said, shaking his head, "and I expect that you're all as weary as I am, or wearier. We'd better halt here for what is left of the night. You know what I mean. In here it is ever dark, but outside the late moon is riding westward, and the middle night has passed." To the left of the great arch they found a stone door. It was half closed, but swung back easily to a gentle thrust. Beyond there seemed to lie a wide chamber cut in the rock. Gandalf went in cautiously, and the others filed behind. "There," he said, pointing with his staff to the middle of the floor. Before his feet they saw a large round hole like the mouth of a well. Broken and rusty chains lay at the edge and trailed down into the black pit. Fragments of stone lay near. The Fellowship rested here. It was Gandalf who roused them all from sleep. He had sat and watched all alone for about 6 hours, and had let the others rest. "And in the watches I've made up my mind," he said. "I do not like the feel of the middle way, and I do not like the smell of the left-hand way. There is foul air down there, or I am no guide. I shall take the right-hand passage. It's time we began to climb up again." For 8 dark hours, not counting 2 brief halts, they marched on, and they met no danger, and heard nothing, and saw nothing but the faint gleam of the wizard's light, bobbing like a will-o'-the-wisp in front of them. The passage they had chosen wound steadily upwards. As far as they could judge, it went in great mounting curves, and as it rose it grew loftier and wider. There were now no openings to other galleries or tunnels on either side, and the floor was level and sound, without pits or cracks. Evidently they had struck what had once been an important road, and they went forward quicker than they had done on their first march. In this way they advanced some 15 miles, measured in a direct line east, though they must have actually walked 20 miles or more. As the road climbed upwards, Frodo's spirits rose a little, but he still felt oppressed, and at times he heard, or thought he heard, away behind the company, and beyond the fall and patter of their feet, a following footstep that was not an echo. So as the Fellowship march along this straightforward route, we can take a minute to mention the history of Moria, which was known as Khazad-dûm to the dwarves. The kingdom was founded by King Durin I, who was believed to be the oldest of the 7 fathers of dwarves, who were the original dwarves created in secret by Aule, one of the Valar. Khazad-dûm was to become the greatest kingdom ever built by the dwarves. The kingdom endured through the ages of Middle-earth until 1980 of the Third Age, when, blinded by greed, the dwarves delved too deeply in search of the precious Mithril. They disturbed a creature which had long lay hidden in the depths, and which slayed the king as well as most of the dwarves in Moria. The creature was then left alone for nearly 5 centuries until orcs from the north began to populate and multiply in these long neglected halls. Though Gandalf was aware of the creature, known as Durin's Bane, dwelling in the depths of Moria, at this point in their journey he did not yet know the nature of the evil that lurked here. They had marched on as far as the hobbits could endure without a rest, and all were thinking of a place where they could sleep, when suddenly the walls to right and left vanished. They seemed to have passed through some arched doorway into a black and empty space. There was a great draught of warmer air behind them, and before them the darkness was cold on their faces. They halted and crowded anxiously together. Gandalf seemed pleased. "I chose the right way," he said. "At last we're coming to the habitable parts, and I guess that we're not far now from the eastern side. But we are high up, a good deal higher than the Dimril Gate, unless I'm mistaken. From the feeling of the air we must be in a wide hall. I will now risk a little real light." He raised his staff, and for a brief instant there was a flame like a flash of lightning. Great shadows sprang up and fled, and for a second they saw a vast roof far above their heads, upheld by many mighty pillars hewn of stone. Before them and on either side stretched a huge empty hall. Its black walls, polished and smooth as glass, flashed and glittered. 3 other entrances they saw, dark black arches, one straight before them eastwards, and one on either side. Then the light went out. The company spent that night in the great cavernous hall, huddled close together in a corner to escape the draught. There seemed to be a steady inflow of chill air through the eastern archway. All about them as they lay hung the darkness, hollow and immense, and they were oppressed by the loneliness and vastness of the dolven halls and endlessly branching stairs and passages. The wildest imaginings that dark rumour had ever suggested to the hobbits fell altogether short of the actual dread and wonder of Moria. After they had breakfasted, Gandalf decided to go on again at once. "We are tired, but we shall rest better when we are outside," he said. "I think that none of us will wish to spend another night in Moria." Following Gandalf's lead, the company passed under the northern arch. They found themselves in a wide corridor. As they went along it, the glimmer grew stronger, and they saw that it came through a doorway on their right. It was high and flat-topped, and the stone door was still upon its hinges, standing half open. Beyond it was a large square chamber. It was dimly lit, but to their eyes, after so long a time in the dark, it seemed dazzlingly bright, and they blinked as they entered. Their feet disturbed a deep dust upon the floor, and stumbled among things lying in the doorway, whose shapes they could not at first make out. The chamber was lit by a wide shaft high in the further eastern wall. It slanted upwards, and, far above, a small square patch of blue sky could be seen. The light of the shaft fell directly on a table in the middle of the room, a single oblong block, about 2 feet high, upon which was laid a great slab of white stone. "It looks like a tomb," muttered Frodo, and bent forwards with a curious sense of foreboding to look more closely at it. Gandalf came quickly to his side. On the slab, runes were deeply graven. "These are Daeron's runes, such as were used of old in Moria," said Gandalf. "Here is written in the tongues of men and dwarves, Balin, son of Fundin, Lord of Moria." "He is dead then," said Frodo. "I feared it was so." Gimli cast his hood over his face. The company stayed in this room, the Chamber of Records, and learned that the dwarves made their last stand in this room where they were slain as they attempted to retake Moria 30 years ago. As Gandalf regained his bearings and they were about to move on, a large group of orcs and uruks, as well as a cave troll, attacked the company in the Chamber of Records. How many there were the company could not count. The affray was sharp, but the orcs were dismayed by the fierceness of the defence. Legolas shot two through the throat. Gimli hewed the legs from under another that had sprung up on Balin's tomb. Boromir and Aragorn slew many. When 13 had fallen, the rest fled shrieking, leaving the defenders unharmed, except for Sam, who had a scratch along the scalp. A quick duck had saved him, and he had felled his orc, a sturdy thrust with his barrow blade. A fire was smouldering in his brown eyes that would have made Ted Sandyman step backwards if he had seen it. "Now is the time," cried Gandalf. "Let us go before the troll returns." As they left, an orc chieftain entered the chamber, spearing Frodo and pinning him against the wall, before Aragorn brought his sword down on the orc's helm. There was a flash like flame and the helm burst asunder. The orc fell with cloven head. His followers fled howling as Boromir and Aragorn sprang at them. Doom, doom, went the drums in the deep. The great voice rolled out again. "Now!" shouted Gandalf. "Now is the last chance! Run for it!" "I'm all right," gasped Frodo. "I can walk. Put me down." Aragorn nearly dropped him in his amazement. "I thought you were dead," he cried. "Not yet," said Gandalf. "But there is no time for wonder. Off you go, all of you, down the stairs. Wait a few minutes for me at the bottom, but if I do not come soon, go on. Go quickly and choose paths leading right and downwards." The passage was lit by no shaft and it was utterly dark. They groped their way down a long flight of steps and then looked back, but they could see nothing except high above them the faint glimmer of the wizard's staff. In time Gandalf returned to the group and they stumbled after him, wondering what had happened. At the end of an hour they had gone a mile, or maybe a little more, and had descended many flights of stairs. There was still no sound of pursuit. Almost they began to hope that they would escape. At the bottom of the 7th flight Gandalf halted. "It's getting hot," he gasped. "We ought to be down at least to the level of the gates now. Soon I think we should look for a left-hand turn to take us east. I hope it's not far. I am very weary." They now went on again. Before long Gimli spoke. He had keen eyes in the dark. "I think," he said, "that there is a light ahead, but it is not daylight, it is red. What can it be?" "Rash," muttered Gandalf. "I wonder if that's what they meant, that the lower levels are on fire. Still, we can only go on." Soon the light became unmistakable and could be seen by all. It was flickering and glowing on the walls away down the passage before them. They could now see their way. In front the road sloped down swiftly, and some way ahead there stood a low archway. Through it the growing light came. The air became very hot. When they came to the arch, Gandalf went through, signing to them to wait. As he stood just beyond the opening, they saw his face lit by a red glow. Quickly he stepped back. "There is some new devilry here," he said, "devised for our welcome, no doubt. But I know now where we are. We have reached the first deep, the level immediately below the gates. This is the second hall of Old Moria, and the gates are near, away beyond the eastern end, on the left, not more than a quarter of a mile. Across the bridge, up a broad stair, along a wide road, through the first hall, and out. But come and look." They peered out. Before them was another cavernous hall. It was loftier and far longer than the one in which they had slept. They were near its eastern end. Westward it ran away into darkness. Down the centre stalked a double line of towering pillars. They were carved like boles of mighty trees whose boughs upheld the roof with a branching tracery of stone. Their stems were smooth, but a red glow was darkly mirrored in their sides. Right across the floor, close to the feet of two huge pillars, a great fissure had opened, Out of it a fierce red light came, and now and again flames licked at the brink and curled about the bases of the columns. Wisps of dark smoke wavered in the hot air. Gandalf turned left and sped across the smooth floor of the hall. The distance was greater than it had looked. As they ran, they heard the beat and echo of many hurrying feet behind. A shrill yell went up. They had been seen. There was a ring and a clash of steel. An arrow whistled over Frodo's head. "Look ahead!" called Gandalf. "The bridge is near. It is dangerous and narrow." Suddenly Frodo saw before him a black chasm. At the end of the hall the floor vanished and fell to an unknown depth. The outer door could only be reached by a slender bridge of stone without curb or rail that spanned the chasm with one curving spring of 50 feet. It was an ancient defence of the dwarves against any enemy that might capture the first hall and the outer passages. They could only pass across it in single file. At the brink Gandalf halted, and the others came up in a pack behind. "Lead the way, Gimli," he said. "Pippin and Merry next, straight on and up the stair beyond the door." Legolas turned and set an arrow to the string, though it was a long shot for his small bow. He drew, but his hand fell, and the arrow slipped to the ground. He gave a cry of dismay and fear. 2 great trolls appeared. They bore great slabs of stone and flung them down to serve as gangways over the fire. But it was not the trolls that had filled the elf with terror. The ranks of the orcs had opened, and they crowded away, as if they themselves were afraid. Something was coming up behind them. What it was could not be seen. It was like a great shadow, in the middle of which was a dark form, of man-shape maybe, yet greater, and a power and terror seemed to be in it and to go before it. It came to the edge of the fire, and the light faded as if a cloud had bent over it. Then with a rush it leaped across the fissure. The flames roared up to greet it, and wreathed about it, and a black smoke swirled in the air. Its streaming mane kindled and blazed behind it. In its right hand was a blade like a stabbing tongue of fire. In its left it held a whip of many thongs. "Aye, aye!" wailed Legolas. A Balrog has come!" Gimli stared with wide eyes. "Durin's bane," he cried, and letting his axe fall he covered his face. "A Balrog," muttered Gandalf. "Now I understand." He faltered and leaned heavily on his staff. "What an evil fortune, and I'm already weary." The dark figure streaming with fire raced towards them. "Over the bridge!" cried Gandalf, recalling his strength. "Fly! This is a foe beyond any of you. I must hold the narrow way. Fly!" The Balrog reached the bridge. Gandalf stood in the middle of the span, leaning on the staff in his left hand, but in his other hand Glamdring gleamed, cold and white. His enemy halted again, facing him, and the shadow about it reached out like 2 vast wings. It raised the whip, and the thongs whined and cracked. Fire came from its nostrils, but Gandalf stood firm. "You cannot pass," he said. The orc stood still, and a dead silence fell. "I am a servant of the secret fire, wielder of the flame of Arnor. You cannot pass. The dark fire will not avail you, Flame of Udun. Go back to the shadow. You cannot pass." The Balrog made no answer. The fire in it seemed to die, but the darkness grew. It stepped forward slowly onto the bridge, and suddenly it drew itself up to a great height, and its wings were spread from wall to wall, but still Gandalf could be seen glimmering in the gloom. He seemed small and altogether alone, grey and bent, like a wizened tree before the onset of a storm. From out of the shadow a red sword leaped flaming. Glamdring glittered white in answer. There was a ringing clash and a stab of white fire. The Balrog fell back, and its sword flew up in molten fragments. The wizard swayed on the bridge, stepping back a pace, and then again stood still. "You cannot pass," he said. With a bound the Balrog leaped full upon the bridge. Its whip whirled and hissed. At that moment Gandalf lifted his staff, and crying aloud he smote the bridge before him. The staff broke asunder and fell from his hand. A blinding sheet of white flame sprang up. The bridge cracked. Right at the Balrog's feet it broke, and the stone upon which it stood crashed into the gulf, while the rest remained poised, quivering like a tongue of rock thrust out into emptiness. With a terrible cry the Balrog fell forward, and its shadow plunged down and vanished. But even as it fell it swung its whip, and the thongs lashed and curled about the wizard's knees, dragging him to the brink. He staggered and fell, grasped vainly at the stone, and slid into the abyss. "Fly, you fools!" he cried, and was gone. They stumbled wildly up the great stairs beyond the door, Aragorn leading, Boromir at the rear. At the top was a wide, echoing passage. Along this they fled. Frodo heard Sam at his side weeping, and then he found that he himself was weeping as he ran. They ran on. The light grew before them. Great shafts pierced the roof. They passed into a hall bright with daylight from its high windows in the east. They fled across it. Through its huge broken doors they passed, and suddenly before them the great gates opened, an arch of blazing light. Out of the gates they ran and sprang down the huge and age-worn steps, the threshold of Moria. Thus, at last, they came beyond hope under the sky, and felt the wind on their faces. Okay, now, as is customary, we can have a quick look at the maps of where Frodo has gone in this episode. So first we can see the Fellowship travelled east from the Doors of Durin and wound their way up through the maze of paths towards the Chamber of Crossroads. Incidentally, if anyone was wanting to replicate this in the game itself, a lot of the paths have been closed off by rocks or things like the Bridge of Khazad-dûm obviously being impassable now, so I had to get creative to overcome some of those issues, but it means you can't easily travel this route in the game, unfortunately. So anyway, here's the next map where we can see where they spent their first night in Moria at the guard room with the well. This is where they stopped to rest in the early hours of January 14th. Then this green line shows where they travelled east along Durin's Way before stopping in a corner of the 21st Hall. This was their final night in Moria, as the next day they travelled first to the Chamber of Records and Balin's tomb, before again heading east down many flights of stairs, before arriving in the second hall, where they continued east over the Bridge of Khazad-dûm and finally into the Dimrill Dale. Here's a map of the entirety of Moria, which shows the impressive scale of the world that they've reproduced here in Lord of the Rings Online. So that's almost it for this episode of Frodo's Journey. Look forward to seeing you next time as Frodo travels towards Lorien, the ancient home of the elves. In the meantime, if you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to my channel here at Talking Tolkien, and thanks for watching.